Snow didn't fall over Warsaw that winter. Ash did. It drifted down in slow, hesitant flakes, turning the streets the color of old bones. At a distance it looked like snow. Up close it clung differently. It stuck to windowsills, sank into cracks, smeared beneath the boots of soldiers and the bare feet of children. It smelled faintly of burned things, wood, paper, cloth, and something else no one wanted to name. Inside the ghetto the ash settled on everything. On the lines of gaunt faces. On the broken cobblestones. On the twisted metal of carts that no longer carried goods, only bodies and scrap. On the faded yellow stars stitched onto threadbare coats. And on him. The boy. People said his skin had turned to ash long before the sky followed. By day the streets of the ghetto were a maze of narrow alleys, makeshift stalls, and shadows that moved even when no one walked there. The buildings leaned inward as if trying to protect each other from what lurked on the other side of the wall. Once, those buildings had windows filled with lace curtains and potted plants, with brass menorahs and photographs framed in polished wood. Once, the streets had echoed with arguments over the price of bread and apples, children's laughter, the sound of a violin drifting from a balcony. Now the curtains were torn or gone, the menorahs hidden or smashed, the photographs burned for warmth or tucked away in secret places. The laughter had fallen silent. The violin strings had snapped. Where there had been life there was now waiting. Waiting for ration lines. Waiting for the next announcement. Waiting for the next name on the list. Waiting for the next knock on the door. Waiting for something worse than hunger. People walked with their heads down, eyes fixed on the ground, as if afraid to meet anyone's gaze and see their own fate reflected back. They moved around each other like ghosts, half there, half gone. But there was one figure the ghetto always seemed to part around. A small boy. Thin as a shadow. White as the ash that coated the roofs. Eyes too dark for a face that pale. He wore a coat that had once been brown and was now simply colorless, drained by winter and dirt and time. His hair, which might have been black or dark brown once, looked muted, dusted, almost gray around the edges as if the air itself had stained it. His skin had that strange ashen tone, neither sickly pink nor the faded yellow of starvation, but a muted gray, as though the world had forgotten to finish painting him. The children called him Zarim under their breath. The gray one. The adults called him something else when they thought he could not hear. The ghost. The ghost child of Warsaw. Before the wall went up, his name had been Eliezer. His mother used to call him Eli in a voice that sounded like warm bread and Sabbath candles. That name still existed somewhere in the folds of his memory, in a house that no longer stood, in a city that no longer existed the way it had. Now very few knew it, and those who did rarely used it. Names drew attention. Attention drew danger. So he walked in silence, and the ghetto made space for him, as if it too believed he wasn't entirely part of the living world anymore. He rarely spoke. But he watched. He watched the rails of the tram that no longer entered the ghetto. He watched the barbed wire crowns looped across the top of the walls. He watched the way the German trucks arrived and left. He watched the uniforms. The regular soldiers, gray-green coats, dull and tired, eyes already far away on an eastern front they hadn't reached yet. The police, blue, stiff, alert, the kind that struck first and asked questions later. And then, sometimes, the black. Black coats. Black gloves. Black caps with skulls glinting faintly in the pale light. When they came, even the air seemed to retreat. And when the SS came, another car sometimes followed. Plain. Quiet. With men whose uniforms were sharp but not decorated with medals. Men whose eyes were calm in a way that made other men nervous. The Gestapo. No one knew exactly which of them was worse. But the boy watched them too. Not with hatred. Not at first. He watched them like a starving person studies a locked door. Not because of what they were. Because of what they controlled. Lists. Keys. Maps. Orders. The shape of life and death written in ink. He didn't know all of that yet, not in words. But he sensed it the way some animals sense storms before humans saw clouds. There was something inside him that listened when others tried not to. Something that stayed awake when others had to sleep. Something that refused to let the world move without noting the pattern of every step. On a certain morning in 1942, the ash fell thicker than usual. Eliezer sat on the cold stone steps outside a building that had once been a bakery. The sign above the door was still there, the letters faded but legible. Seely B. Bread. A word that now tasted like a memory more than food. The shop was empty inside, its window broken, shelves bare except for a few pieces of broken glass and a cracked ceramic plate someone hadn't bothered to steal. He sat there with his knees drawn up to his chest, hands tucked into the sleeves of his coat. The ash clung to his hair, his eyelashes, his shoulders. He did not brush it off. People passed him without stopping. Eyes slid over him and away, as though afraid that really seeing him meant seeing something else they weren't ready for. An old man shuffled by with a stack of newspapers under his arm, old issues, worthless except as kindling. He paused for a moment when he saw the boy. "You'll freeze, Dutch," he muttered, not unkindly. The boy blinked slowly. "I'm not cold," he whispered. It was true. He didn't feel the cold the way he used to. Not because he was warm. Because everything was cold. His hands. His face. His memories. Numbness had settled across him like another layer of ash. The old man shook his head and moved on. A girl with tangled hair and hollow eyes approached next, her face streaked with soot. She stopped a few steps away, biting her lip. "They say you sleep on the roofs," she whispered. He looked at her. Her eyes were a faded green. Once they might have glowed. Now they flickered like a candle in a draft. "They say you never eat," she added. He tilted his head slightly. "Someone is always watching," he replied softly. "It's harder to see them if they're looking at me." She frowned. "Who?" she asked. His gaze drifted to the end of the street, where the wall rose like a dirty tooth against the sky. "The men in black," he murmured. "The ones with the skulls. And the quiet ones who don't shout." The girl shivered and backed away. "I don't like talking about them." "I don't either," he said. But he watched them. He always watched. Before the ghetto, his world had been small and warm. A kitchen that smelled of garlic and onions, of bread and stew. A small bedroom with a wooden bed and a faded blue blanket. A shelf of books his father read from every evening, his voice rolling over stories of kingdoms and deserts and seas. A photograph on the wall, his parents standing together, his mother's hand resting on his father's arm, both of them looking slightly surprised to have been captured in that moment forever. He had watched them then too. Not with suspicion. With admiration. His mother's hands moving in automatic grace as she kneaded dough, wiped his face, smoothed his hair. His father's fingers curling around the pages of a book, tracing lines of text, gesturing when he grew passionate about some story or teaching. He used to sit quietly in the corner, memorizing the curve of every gesture, the rhythm of their movements. Not because he thought he would need to remember. Because he loved them. He had not known that one day, those memories would be all he would have left. On the morning they were taken, the sky had been clear. No ash yet. No snow either. Just a sharp blue coldness that made everything look too clean. The knock on the door echoed through his bones. He remembered the way his mother's eyes had flicked toward the mezuzah on the doorframe before she opened it, as if asking for protection from something the wood and parchment could no longer keep out. He remembered the black boots on the threshold. The calm face of the officer. The clipped words. The paper held up like something holy. Names. Numbers. Destinations. He remembered his father's hands shaking for the first time. He remembered his own feet rooted to the floor, his body heavy, his voice gone. He remembered the moment his mother turned to him and smiled, a small, wavering smile that told him everything she couldn't say out loud. Don't make a sound. Don't move. Don't draw their eyes. A command. A blessing. A curse. He had obeyed so well that one of the officers brushed past him as if he weren't even there. As if he was already a shadow. As if he had become invisible just by needing to be. He hadn't spoken a word as they led his parents away. He hadn't moved as the door slammed. He hadn't cried until the sky turned dark and the room with the photograph felt too large. After that, the world shrank. The walls closed in. The streets narrowed. The sky lowered. And he learned something that would become the only weapon he had. If you are small enough, quiet enough, still enough, they don't see you. Not really. Their eyes pass over you like over a crack in the wall or a stain on the pavement. And if they don't see you, they don't count you. They don't list you. They don't send you away. At first, that was all he used it for. Survival. But survival has a way of sharpening into something else when it's the only thing you have. A siren screamed in the distance. Not close. Not yet. But loud enough that every head in the street lifted. The girl with the green eyes disappeared into the nearest doorway. The old man with the newspapers hunched his shoulders and hurried away. Eliezer, Zarim, the ghost child, the ash-skinned boy, stood slowly. He stepped down from the bakery steps, ash whispering under his worn soles. From where he stood, he could see the gate at the far end of the street, the narrow break in the wall where guards stood watch. Today there were more of them. Not just regular soldiers. Black coats. And behind them, near a car that looked cleaner than anything else in the ghetto, two men in plain uniforms, their coats pressed, their collars neat. They weren't shouting. They were reading. Looking at lists. Gestapo. He couldn't hear them from this distance, but he watched their lips move, the way their eyes flicked up at each person escorted through the gate. He saw how long they stared. How quickly they dismissed. Who they examined closer. Who they didn't bother to look at twice. He watched one of them point to a line on the paper and then to a building nearby. A moment later, 2 soldiers moved in that direction. As if the man's finger itself carried weight. As if the paper controlled the street. Eliezer's eyes narrowed. He knew what that meant. He had seen it before. A search. An arrest. A disappearance. His fingers curled unconsciously around something in his pocket. A small scrap of paper. Edges soft. Ink smudged. The last note his father had left him, tucked into a book on the nightstand the day before they were taken away. He didn't read it anymore. He didn't need to. The words were carved into him. Watch more than you speak, Eli. The world talks all the time, it just doesn't always use words. He watched. He watched the Gestapo officer fold the list slowly, tuck it into his coat and turn away. He watched the soldiers move into position. He watched the street empty as if the ghetto itself understood what was about to happen. The air thickened. The ash hung lower. The silence deepened. Something inside him settled. Not calm. Not quite. But something close to clarity. He took a step backward, disappearing into the narrow throat of an alley. The shadows swallowed him easily as though they knew him well. The Gestapo men did not look in his direction. Their eyes swept the street. They saw the wall. They saw the houses. They saw the people. They did not see the boy who watched them. Not yet. Not today. But the ghetto had long memories even when its people did not. And one day even those men in black coats and quiet voices would remember the boy they never really saw. The boy whose skin looked like ash. The boy who moved like a shadow. The boy whose silence was sharper than a knife. The boy who would turn their lists against them. The ghost child of Warsaw. That night, as darkness poured into the ghetto and the ash fell in thicker sheets, Eliezer lay on the flat rooftop of a building near the gate. The tar beneath him was cold and rough. His coat was too thin. His breath rose in faint white puffs that the wind carried away almost as soon as they formed. He pressed his ear to the brick chimney, listening. Voices moved through the walls, muffled German, the scrape of chairs, the rattle of keys, the rustle of more paper. 2 floors down, in some requisitioned room, the men in plain uniforms were working. He didn't know what they were writing. Not exactly. But he knew what happened after the writing stopped. He closed his eyes and imagined the room. The table. The lamp. The stack of dry, clean paper. The pen scratching, steady, indifferent. He imagined the list. Not as words. As paths. Lines connecting names to doors. Doors connecting to people. People connecting to trains. And trains connecting to nothing. The ash clung to his eyelashes. He did not wipe it away. His fingers moved slowly over the rooftop until they found a loose brick at the edge. He gripped it, feeling the roughness against his palm. He listened to the muffled sound of pages turning. In his mind he saw the lines. Names. Numbers. Arrows. Paths. For the first time, something new flickered in his chest. Not just fear. Not just grief. Not just numbness. A question. Not what are they doing? But, how can I change what they do? The thought was small, fragile, almost absurd. But it stayed. And as the ash fell thicker and the voices below kept writing the shape of other people's fates, the ghost child of Warsaw opened his eyes, staring into the darkness. He wasn't a ghost. Not yet. But soon, the men below would whisper about him as if he was. And some of them would swear that, for a moment, as they bent over their lists in that dim, suffocating room, they felt eyes on the back of their necks. Cold. Calm. Waiting. Eyes of a child they'd never bothered to see. That was the night the boy who had learned to be unseen stopped only hiding from the lists. And quietly, invisibly, began to think about how to write himself between the lines. To twist them. To bend them. To break them. Even if it meant becoming exactly what the ghetto already believed he was. A ghost. A rumor. A myth. The ash fell differently the next morning. It came down in slow spirals instead of drifting straight, as though unsure of where to land, as though the sky itself hesitated to touch the ghetto. The wind carried it in swirls along the rooftops and into the narrow alleys where children once played before space became a luxury and laughter became dangerous. Eliezer walked through the gray haze with the same quiet presence he always carried, but today something inside him hummed, soft, low, almost like the vibration of a string plucked lightly in an empty room. He felt it before he understood it. Not fear. Not hunger. Not cold. A kind of awareness. A tuning. As if something in him had clicked into alignment with the world around him, not the visible part but the part beneath it. The part most people didn't sense anymore because fear made their senses dull, fogged, desperate. But his sharpened. It started with a sound. Not the heavy boots of German patrols. Not the cries of vendors selling scraps of vegetables. Not the coughing of the sick. It was something smaller. Paper. Paper moving. A faint, distant rustle. 2 streets away. Inside a building with boarded windows. He shouldn't have heard it. But he did. And he stopped walking. He froze beside the wall of an abandoned tailor's shop, the plaster cracked and peeling. People passed him without pausing, but 1 or 2 glanced quickly, nervously, as if they knew better than to disturb the ash-skinned boy when he went still like that. He tilted his head slightly. There it was again. A rustle. Pause. A faint scrape, the edge of a pen dragged across paper. Then a murmur of voices. Soft. Clip. German. He did not know who they belonged to. But he knew what they were doing. Listen. Always listen. He closed his eyes and breathed in deeply, not to calm himself but to listen better. The world blurred. The cold air seemed to quiet itself for him. Even the ash seemed to hover, suspended, as though waiting for his permission to fall. He could tell. There were 3 men. 1 old, 1 middle-aged, 1 with a smoker's rasp. 1 flipped papers impatiently. 1 wrote in sharp, angry strokes. The other paced. He heard boots tapping out a rhythm. 12 steps, pause. 12 steps, pause. He opened his eyes slowly. He had just discovered something about himself. Something he had not known was possible. He could hear with more than his ears. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't magic. It was attention, so precise it bordered on the impossible. He listened long enough to understand the pacing man had a limp. He listened long enough to know the rasping man held matches in his left pocket. They clinked softly against the box. He listened long enough to know the one writing had a ring on his right hand, a signet that tapped the desk every time he finished a word. Tup, tup, tup. He could feel the rhythm vibrating slightly through the ground. He breathed out, then turned away. No one saw his face in that moment. If they had, they would have noticed something subtle, frightening, new. A flicker behind his dark eyes. The flicker of someone who now sensed the world on a different frequency. He didn't go home. Not yet. Instead he climbed. He slipped into the alley behind the tailor's shop and scaled the broken drainpipe with ease, movements so smooth it looked like he barely touched it. When he reached the rooftop he stayed low, crawling until he reached the far edge. From there he could see the building where the voices came from. A requisitioned apartment. 3 floors. Boarded windows. A chimney with no smoke, burners off, stove extinguished. Meaning, they weren't comfortable. They weren't staying long. He lay flat on the cold surface, letting the ash gather on his coat, his hair, his cheekbones. From above, he disappeared almost entirely into the rooftop. Gray on gray. Stillness on stillness. A shadow shaped like a boy. Hours passed. He didn't move. Didn't fidget. Didn't shift his weight. Not even when the cold gnawed at his fingers. When the light changed from pale morning to sickly afternoon. When his stomach twisted for the first time that day. He didn't move because he didn't need to. He was listening. The voices inside had moved. Not floor to floor, room to room. He could tell. He could hear. He could even tell how far they stood from the wall by the way the sound echoed. He had no training. No books. No father to teach him. No soldier to imitate. He had only hunger, silence, and the brutal instinct to survive. But he was learning something powerful. If you listen long enough, if you pay attention with the desperation of someone whose life depends on it, the world reveals its secrets. Not willingly. Not kindly. But it does. By late afternoon the men began to argue. He couldn't hear all of it, not the words. But he could hear tone, texture, breath patterns. He memorized them. And when one of the men stood and slammed a drawer, he memorized the rhythm of the slam. 3 sharp impacts. As if the drawer was stuck. Meaning, old desk. Possibly damaged. He filed this away without effort. Without strain. Without knowing why. Because something in him had become a net. Catching everything. Every sound. Every pattern. Every interval. Every detail that might matter later. He didn't know the term for what he was becoming. A mimic. A strategist. A silent observer. A recorder. A ghost with a perfect ear. He would not define it for years. But in the ghetto the ability had already begun to shift fate. And theirs. Just before dusk, a German officer emerged from the building. Not SS. Not Gestapo. Just regular infantry. But that didn't mean safety. The officer lit a cigarette, cupping his hand against the wind. He muttered something under his breath. German curses Eliezer didn't understand. The officer checked his watch. Then his pocket. Then the bag slung over his shoulder. He was nervous, distracted. He walked toward the gate, boots crunching lightly over the frost. Eliezer followed. Not from the rooftops. Not from the alley. From the street. He slipped down the drainpipes silently, landing with a softness that barely disturbed the snow-dusted ground. He pulled his hood tight and stepped into the thinning crowd. He walked behind the officer at a distance that looked accidental. Step for step. Shadow for shadow. Never too close. Never too far. He listened. To the cadence of the man's stride. To the jingle of something metallic in his coat. To the soft exhale of cigarette smoke. When the man crossed the square, Eliezer turned away. But not before noticing something. The officer had dropped something. A piece of paper. Not white, gray. Not clean, creased. Not random, folded into quarters. Eliezer's eyes fixed on it. No one else saw it. No one else would see it. People in the ghetto didn't pick up German papers. It was suicide. But the ghost child was not most people. When the officer turned the corner, Eliezer approached the paper. Slowly. Cautiously. His fingers hovered above it as though expecting it to burst into flames. Then he picked it up. A folded note. German handwriting. Official ink. But that wasn't the important part. The important part was the imprint. The paper had been folded around something for a long time. Something hard. A key. A single key. He felt the pressure marks. He memorized the spacing. The angle. The weight. Not with words. With sensation. He closed the note and tucked it into his coat. This wasn't bravery. It was instinct. Something inside him whispered. This paper was not meant to be lost. Which means someone will come looking for it. Which means someone will be angry. Which means someone will be careless. And careless men make mistakes. He breathed out slowly. The ash drifted past his face. He didn't blink. That night, he returned home with the paper hidden under his shirt. His grandmother looked up as he entered. Miriam sat beside the stove, warming her hands over the fading fire. "You're late," Miriam whispered. Her voice trembled. She hated how empty the streets became after dark. Eliezer didn't answer. Not yet. He moved to the table and unfolded the note under the candlelight. His grandmother's eyes widened. Her breath hitched. "No," she whispered. "No, no, you cannot, Eliezer. Do you know what this is?" He didn't. Not fully. But he knew enough. "It doesn't matter," he murmured. "It matters more than anything," she hissed. "If the Germans find this here." "They won't." "You don't know that." He looked up slowly. "I do." And something in his eyes, something quiet, eerie, unwavering, made her fall silent. She watched him as he traced the edge of the paper, his fingers moving gently as though following invisible lines. His brows furrowed slightly, not in confusion but concentration. He wasn't reading the German words. He was reading the pressure marks, the small flaws, the way the fibers bent. As if the key had left a ghostly map on the paper. And the boy with ash on his skin could see maps no one else saw. Later, long after his grandmother and sister slept, he sat alone by the window. The moonlight spilled across the table, pale and thin. He held the paper up to the light and closed one eye. He tilted it, shifted it, watched how the shadows fell across the folds. And with slow, deliberate certainty, the imprint of the key revealed itself like a faint silhouette. Long shaft, single tooth, deep notch, German manufacture. Likely for a drawer, or a safe. On a desk. Inside a requisition building. Where 3 men had argued. Where papers were written. Where lists were made. His pulse didn't speed up. His hands didn't shake. He looked calm. But inside his mind, a series of shapes aligned. A thought formed. If I know the key, I know the lock. And if he knew the lock, I know what they're hiding. He breathed out slowly and the air fogged the paper for a moment. He watched the fog fade. He whispered, "They think no one listens." His reflection in the window stared back at him, hollow eyes, pale face, ash-dusted hair. A ghost. But not a helpless one. Not anymore. Before dawn he climbed onto the roof again. Not to hide. Not to watch patrols. To listen. He pressed his cheek to the cold surface. Closed his eyes. Matched his breathing to the rhythm of the wind. And slowly, piece by piece, the ghetto unfolded inside his mind again. But this time it was sharper. He heard. A woman crying 3 houses away. A guard tapping a baton against metal. 2 men whispering behind a boarded window. A cart rolling over uneven stones. A radio playing static in German. A dog barking somewhere beyond the wall. A child coughing in their sleep. Footsteps. Keys. Paper. Breath. Everything. He heard everything. And none of it overwhelmed him. It organized itself. It formed patterns. Layers. Inputs and outputs. Cause and effect. His mind worked like a machine built out of hunger, trauma, and instinct. Something shaped by survival into a tool no one would expect from a child. He opened his eyes as the first light of morning touched the rooftops. The ash still fell. But now it felt different. As if the world had shifted its weight. As if something inside him had awakened fully. As if the ghetto's ghost child had become more than a rumor. More than a shadow. More than a boy hiding from lists. He was beginning to understand the lists. How they worked. Who made them. How they moved. How they were enforced. How they could be destroyed. Not by strength. Not by violence. Not by fire. But by precision. By silence. By the mind of a child no one saw coming. He whispered to the empty dawn. I'm not on their lists. Pause. A breath. And they won't be able to put me on them. Another pause. A colder whisper. And someday, I'll decide who goes on theirs. As he rose to his feet, the sound of marching boots echoed faintly through the ghetto. Dozens of them. Not normal patrols. A sweep. He recognized the rhythm instantly, faster, harsher, out of sync with routine. He turned his head slowly. The soldiers were coming. Not for him. Not yet. But for someone. And the ghost child of Warsaw would be watching. Listening. Learning. And preparing. Because the next time they wrote a list, he would be ready. The morning began without sound. Not silence, absence. A hollow emptiness that felt as unnatural as a missing heartbeat. No murmured prayers. No quiet complaints. No clatter of pots being moved by desperate hands. No children whispering under blankets. No vendors calling out scraps of onions or frozen potatoes. The ghetto seemed to be holding its breath. Even the ash fell slowly, drifting down as if afraid to disturb the ground. Eliezer woke instantly. Not from noise, there was none, but from pressure. A weight on the air. A tightening on his skin. A shift in the world's rhythm. His body reacted before his mind formed the thought. They are here. He sat upright on the thin mattress. Across the room, Miriam slept curled into herself, and their grandmother sat in her corner, eyes open, rosary of string and knots wrapped around her frail fingers. She had felt it too. She whispered, Eliezer, don't go outside today. But the problem was he didn't need to go outside. The danger was coming to him. He closed his eyes and listened. At first it was faint, boots striking stone in uneven cadence. Not marching in formation. Moving in clusters. Fast. Agitated. Searching. Arrayed. But not a typical one. These soldiers were angry. He could hear it in their steps. In their breath. In how their coats rustled with tension. In how their rifles clicked against their belts. He could feel it. Something had been taken from them. Something important. Something that made them reckless. The note. The missing paper. The key imprint that had once pressed into it. The officer who dropped it must have discovered the loss. And someone somewhere had reported it. That was why the ghetto was waking to boots instead of voices. That was why the air felt tight. That was why the ghost child's heartbeat didn't change at all. He simply stood, reached for his coat and whispered, I'll be careful. The first crack in the morning stillness came from the far end of the street. A man shouted. A heavy door was kicked open. A woman screamed a single name before a hand silenced her. Eliezer flinched, not visibly but internally, as if the scream struck the inside of his skull. He moved to the window. His grandmother grabbed his wrist, fingers trembling. Do not look, Eliezer. You don't need to see this. He gently released her hold. I do, he whispered, because seeing meant understanding. Understanding meant surviving. And surviving meant more now than ever. He pressed his cheek to the cold wooden frame and peered through a crack in the boards. 2 Gestapo officers walked down the street, flanked by German infantry. They held a list, one of many, and pointed at random houses ordering soldiers inside. But this time something was different. They weren't looking for Jews at random. They weren't looking for laborers. They weren't searching for smugglers. They were looking for something specific. Someone specific. Eliezer watched their movements, absorbing them like ink into paper. The Gestapo officer in the front, Hauptmann Weiss, checked the list every few seconds, flipping the pages with agitation. His jaw clenched in visible irritation. His eyes darted from name to door, as if he didn't quite trust the list he carried. That was unusual. The Gestapo trusted their lists more than they trusted their own families. Weiss barked to a soldier, "Überprüfen Sie es alle." Every single one. The soldier hesitated. "But, sir, the list." "I said all of them." That was when Eleazar's stomach dropped. This wasn't a selection. It was a hunt. A hunt for an irregularity. A mistake. A missing item. A missing paper. His paper. He felt no guilt. No fear. Only recognition. This was the consequence of taking something from a machine that didn't tolerate missing gears. He whispered to himself. "They think someone stole from them." His grandmother's voice quivered behind him. "Eleazar, they won't leave until they take someone." He didn't respond. Because he already knew. He heard the pattern in Weiss's voice. He heard the frustration, the rage. He heard the subtle crack, fear. Fear of explaining an error to a superior officer. That fear made Weiss dangerous. Made him unpredictable. Made him sloppy. But it also made him blind. The soldiers reached the building across the street. A father begged. A mother clutched a baby. A teenage boy stepped forward with hands raised. Weiss didn't care. He flipped the list, pointed at the boy, and without looking again said, "Take him." Eleazar's heart tightened. That name was not on the list. He knew. He had memorized the cadence of the names Weiss read. But the Gestapo didn't know who to blame. So they blamed anyone. The boy was dragged screaming, heels scraping against ice. Eleazar's fingers curled into fists. "Why him?" Miriam whispered, awake now, eyes wide with horror. "Wrong place," their grandmother murmured, voice breaking. "Wrong time. Wrong number drawn." Eleazar shook his head. "No. Wrong answer." His grandmother blinked. "What?" "They don't know what they're looking for," he whispered. "So they're trying to make the world confess." Weiss raised his head suddenly. He paused, turned, stared directly at Eleazar's building, as if he sensed something. A presence. A shift. A challenge. Eleazar didn't move. Weiss squinted, then pointed toward their door. A soldier stepped forward. Another. Another. "Eleazar," his grandmother whispered, voice shaking with terror. "Hide. Hide now." But he didn't. He simply stepped away from the window, calm as the ash that floated past the glass. When the soldiers knocked, not a polite knock but a blow that rattled the hinges, his grandmother staggered back. Miriam covered her mouth to muffle a sob. Eleazar walked toward the door. Not quickly. Not bravely. Not obediently. With the inevitability of someone who had already seen the shape of what was coming. He stopped beside the door. He listened. 3 soldiers. 1 Gestapo agent. 1 nervous, 2 bored, 1 irritated. Finger-tapping rifle. Glove-rubbing fabric. The Gestapo officers breathing fast, not from exertion but fear. "Weiss." He whispered through the door, voice shaking with forced authority. "Open. Now." His grandmother mouthed a prayer. Miriam cried silently. Eleazar did nothing. The second blow shook dust from the ceiling. The third blow cracked the wood. Weiss barked, "We know someone from this building took something. Bring the boy out." Eleazar's grandmother gasped. Miriam froze. But he remained perfectly still. Because he heard something they didn't. Weiss didn't know which boy. He was guessing. He had no information. Which meant, the boy he wanted was not a person. It was a concept. A suspect. A placeholder. A scapegoat. A space the Germans needed to fill. A blank they needed to punish. Eleazar stepped back from the door. His grandmother hissed, "Where are you going?" He whispered calmly, "I'm not on his list." The door cracked further. "But he will put you there," she cried. Eleazar turned to her with a slow, quiet blink. "No," he whispered. "He only thinks he can." With a violent crack, the door split open. Weiss entered, breath sharp, eyes red with frustration. He scanned the room. Saw the grandmother. Saw Miriam. Then saw him. The ash-skinned child. Small. Pale. Eyes too dark. Too calm. Weiss froze. Not long, only a second. But in that second, Weiss's fear spiked. He didn't understand why. He simply felt it, something in the boy's stillness, in his silence, in the way the ash clung to his cheeks like war paint, made the officer's heartbeat jump. "We had reports," Weiss said, voice trembling slightly, "that a child from this home interfered with German property." That was a lie. He had no reports. He had suspicion. He needed a target. And the ghost child looked like someone the universe would choose for suffering. Eliezer didn't blink. What did he take? His grandmother demanded, surprising even herself with the fire in her voice. Weiss hesitated. Crack. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what was missing, only that something was. So he snapped. A document. Which document? She shot back. Weiss stiffened. He didn't know. He hated that he didn't know. Eliezer watched the officer's jaw tighten. Watched his hands tremble. Watched his eyes dart toward the boy again and again as if searching for guilt. Weiss saw ash on the boy's skin. And mistook it for evidence. He stepped forward and grabbed Eliezer's arm. That one? Weiss growled. Bring him. Miriam screamed. The grandmother collapsed to her knees. But Eliezer did nothing. He didn't fight. Didn't resist. Didn't speak. He simply watched. Listen. Not to Weiss. To everything else. The tension in the soldiers behind him. The nervous breath of the infantryman. The way Weiss's fingers gripped, not strongly but desperately. Weiss wasn't capturing a criminal. He was capturing a solution. A way to explain his mistake. A way to survive his superior officer's anger. A human shield made of a child. An unjust offering. And that was the moment the ghetto truly saw him. Not as a ghost. Not as a rumor. But as a victim of injustice so pure, so cruel, so undeserved, that something inside the ghetto cracked. Women cried. Men looked away. Children hid. The elderly whispered prayers for a boy no one could save. And as Weiss dragged him into the street, as the ash fell heavier than ever, as the wind howled through empty alleyways, Eliezer stayed silent. Because silence was what the world expected from him. But silence was also his weapon. His patience. His power. And his revenge. They dragged him past the house where the teenage boy had been taken. The mother still knelt in the doorway, face in her hands. When she looked up and saw Eliezer being taken too, something inside her broke. No, she whispered. Not him. He didn't do anything. Another woman echoed. That's the Ash boy, he hasn't spoken to anyone in weeks. Why him? A man whispered. The Germans don't need reasons. Weiss turned sharply and shouted. Anyone who interferes will be shot. But no one interfered. Not because they didn't want to. Because they couldn't. The injustice was absolute. The hopelessness suffocating. But even as the world crumbled around him, the boy with ash on his skin kept listening. He heard. The fear in Weiss's breath. The crack in his voice. The frustration in every step. The panic beneath the anger. And he understood something crucial. Weiss wasn't in control. He was cornered. Desperate. And desperate men made mistakes. Eliezer whispered under his breath, so faintly only he could hear. I'll use them. The soldiers shoved him forward. Weiss pointed toward the requisition building. Inside, the officer snapped. Now. Eliezer stepped through the doorway. And as the door slammed behind him, as the cold swallowed the sunlight, as the room darkened around him, he sensed it. This was the moment his story would break. And then rebuild itself into something sharp. Something strategic. Something terrifying. Something necessary. This was the moment the ghost child of Warsaw stopped being a legend. And became a threat. Inside the interrogation room, he saw the desk from which the paper had been dropped. The drawer with the stuck handle. The ring marks on the wood. The pattern of scratches. He recognized everything from sound alone. Weiss stepped behind him, breath hot with fear and anger. And as Weiss reached for the drawer key he no longer possessed, Eliezer whispered almost tenderly, "You won't find what you're looking for." Weiss froze. His hand trembled. And the boy smiled. A small, quiet, merciless smile. The kind that only a child who had been wronged too deeply could hold without shaking. The door slammed shut behind Eliezer with a hollow echo that swallowed the air. The interrogation room was not large. Not frightening by design. But terrifying by implication. A single table. A single chair. A single lamp that flickered with the erratic heartbeat of the failing power grid. The smell of damp boots. Cold walls stained with moisture. Shadows like bruises clinging to the corners. Eliezer stood perfectly still, letting the room breathe around him. The silence pressed into him like a second skin. Behind him, Weiss locked the door with a sharp metallic click. Not for security. For control. For dominance. For the illusion that he held power over a child made of ash, silence, and something he feared but could not define. Weiss walked past him, trying to compose himself. His movements were stiff, jerky, the gestures of a man who needed to look authoritative but whose hands betrayed him. The officer yanked open the desk drawer. It did not budge. He pulled harder. Still stuck. Eliezer blinked slowly. Of course it was stuck. It always stuck on the left rail. Weiss grunted in frustration, grabbing the drawer with both hands and shaking it violently. It screeched. The room screeched with it. Open, damn you, Weiss snarled. Open. Eliezer tilted his head, studying him like a specimen. This is not about the drawer, the boy whispered softly. Weiss froze. His breathing stopped for half a second. He turned his head sharply toward the boy. What did you say? Eliezer didn't answer. Because he didn't need to. Weiss's jaw clenched. He straightened. He pulled out a key. A key that should have opened the drawer. A key that no longer opened anything. Weiss inserted it into the lock. Turned. The metal refused to move. The officer's face drained of color. Because now it was real. The missing paper, the misplaced key imprint, the evidence he could not explain. It all began with this drawer. With this key. With this mistake. Weiss stepped back shaken. He looked at Eliezer again. This time not with suspicion, but with terror. What do you know? Weiss hissed. What did you see? Eliezer leaned slightly forward, voice still soft, still empty of emotion. I saw everything you didn't. Weiss slammed his fist onto the desk. Stop speaking in riddles? You think you're clever? Eliezer didn't blink. No. Weiss blinked instead. That alone unbalanced him. The officer pointed a trembling finger at the boy. You will tell me what you took. Right now. Eliezer stepped closer, not aggressively, not fearfully, simply moving with the calm inevitability of someone who had already foreseen the path of every breath in the room. I didn't take anything, he said. Weiss laughed, a brittle, humorless sound. Of course you didn't. All Jews say that. Eliezer's expression remained unchanged. But you lost something. Weiss flinched. Eliezer continued. And now someone must pay for it. The officer's breath hitched. Who told you that? He barked. Who informed you? No one, Eliezer whispered. I listened. Weiss's eyes widened. The boy continued, voice smooth as falling ash. You muttered to yourself when you arrived at the ghetto's gate. You ordered the men to search every house, even the ones not on your list. You're not confident. You're afraid. There it was. Exposed. A truth Weiss didn't dare admit even to himself. Every soldier had a fear. But a Gestapo officer, especially one under direct command, had a different kind. A deadlier kind. The fear of reporting a mistake. The fear of being seen as incompetent. The fear of losing control. Weiss stumbled back a step, hitting the desk. You know nothing, he shouted. Eliezer took another step closer. I know you don't fear me. The officer's mouth twitched, unsure if it should smile or scream. I know you fear him. Weiss's eyes darkened. Who? He spat. Your superior, Eliezer whispered. The one who will demand to know how you lost a document. Weiss swallowed hard. And how you blamed a child to cover your mistake. That hit like a hammer. Weiss grabbed Eliezer by the front of his shirt, lifting him off the ground with sudden, violent panic. Stop it, he shouted, voice cracking. Stop speaking like that. Eliezer looked directly into the man's eyes. I haven't said anything untrue. Weiss released him abruptly, stepping back with visible fear. The officer's hands shook so violently that he clenched them into fists just to hide it. You, Weiss whispered as if trying to convince himself, you're just a boy. Eliezer lowered his gaze for the first time. Not in submission. In calculation. And that's why you chose me, he answered quietly. Because I'm small. Because I look weak. Because I'm easy to blame. Weiss swallowed. Several times. The boy's words were disassembling him piece by piece. Eliezer turned to the drawer. The paper you lost, he murmured, was folded once. You keep your papers flat unless they contain sensitive information. This one had a crease. Weiss stiffened. How? When you dropped it, Eliezer continued, ignoring his panic, your heel twisted the edge. I heard it wrinkle. The sound is different when the paper has been folded before. Weiss's knees almost buckled. Eliezer looked at the stuck drawer. And you always pull the drawer too hard. That's why it sticks. The officer stared at him, horrified. It wasn't the detail that scared him. It was the way the boy used it. Not as a confession. As a mirror. Reflecting every flaw, every weakness, every error Weiss wished to bury. You, Weiss whispered again, softer now, you're not a child. Eliezer didn't respond. Because the answer didn't matter. The room remained suspended in fragile silence. Weiss's breathing grew ragged. He paced in tight circles, gripping his hair, muttering curses at himself, the room, the missing paper, the freezing winter, everything except the boy. Eliezer stood still, letting the panic swirl around him like snow in a storm. Finally, Weiss slammed his hand on the table. "There must be an explanation," he whispered. Something I can report, something that makes sense." "You want someone else to blame," Eliezer said. Weiss glared, and then froze. Because the boy wasn't accusing him. He was offering him something. Weiss narrowed his eyes. "What are you suggesting?" Eliezer's gaze drifted to the door. "To survive this," he said softly, "you need a culprit." Weiss's eyes twitched. "And you think that culprit is not you," Eliezer continued. Weiss swallowed. "And not me." The officer's breath stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. Weiss took one slow step forward. His voice came out barely audible. "If not you, then who?" Eliezer didn't smile. It would have ruined everything. But something faint, cold, and terrifying flickered behind his eyes. "You already know," he answered. Weiss's heart hammered against his ribs. The boy's voice dropped to a whisper. "You just want someone else to say it?" Weiss backed away, shaking his head violently. No, you're trying to trick me. I'm not saying anything without proof." Eliezer tilted his head. "Proof? Yes. That was what Weiss needed. Not truth. Something that looked like truth. Something that would keep him alive when he reported to his superior." Eliezer stepped toward the desk. He lifted his hand and pressed the drawer's left rail. The stuckwood shifted with a quiet, exact click. Weiss's mouth fell open. The drawer slid open effortlessly. Inside it, papers, forms, lists, stamps, keys, and an empty space where one paper should have been. A shape of absence. A ghost of something lost. Eliezer said nothing. He waited. Waited for Weiss's mind to put the pieces together. Waited for panic to bloom into the only kind of clarity someone like Weiss could understand. The enemy is not the child. It is someone close. Someone careless. Someone real. Weiss gasped. There was only one other person who had access to this drawer. He said it without meaning to. Without thinking. The boy did not react. Weiss's thoughts spiraled. Corbin. My aide. He was here yesterday. He had the keys for an hour. He never signs anything properly. He always makes mistakes. He could have lost it. He could have taken it. He could be spying. Eliezer whispered. You found your answer. Weiss's eyes filled with relief so intense it was almost a sob. I must report this. Yes, of course. Corbin will answer for this. Not me. Not me. Eliezer watched him unravel. Watched him cling to the lifeline he had been handed. Watched him choose survival over truth, over duty, over everything the Gestapo pretended to be. Then Weiss froze. He turned slowly, looked at Eliezer, and whispered, Why did you help me? Eliezer blinked. I didn't help you. Weiss frowned. You saved me from punishment. Eliezer stepped forward, ash falling from his sleeve like gray snow. No, he said softly, I saved me. Weiss stared at him. The boy continued, You needed a story. I needed your attention elsewhere. Now we both have what we want. Weiss shivered, because he suddenly understood. The child was not innocent, not harmless, not ordinary. The child was strategic, calculated, quiet in the way a blade is quiet. Weiss stepped back instinctively. The boy did not follow. He simply said, You will release me now. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact. Weiss swallowed. I must confirm. Open the door, Eliezer said. Weiss hesitated. Not because he disagreed, but because some instinct, buried deep, primal, ancient, told him, Do not refuse the child. Do not corner him. Do not challenge him. Weiss stepped to the door. His hand shook on the key. He unlocked it, opened it, and the cold corridor stood empty, waiting. Eliezer stepped forward. Weiss grabbed his arm for the briefest moment. The boy looked back. Weiss whispered, What are you? Eliezer gazed at him, expression unreadable. It was the closest he had come to smiling. But not a warm smile. A knowing one. A smile that promised something Weiss didn't want to understand. Something inevitable. Something approaching. I'm the child you should never have hunted, he whispered. And then he walked out. Without fear. Without hesitation. Without looking back. As Eliezer stepped into the hallway, soldiers glanced at him nervously. Not because they recognized him. Because they sensed something unnatural about his release. Weiss stumbled out seconds later, pale as ghost bone, waving the soldiers away. It's resolved. He may go. The soldiers shared looks of confusion. But they obeyed. Because fear always outranked logic. Eliezer passed them like a shadow. Like smoke. Like a myth being born. But halfway down the corridor, a new sound reached his ears. Footsteps. Heavy. Authoritative. Angrier than Weiss. More controlled. More dangerous. An SS Oberst. A superior officer. One who knew nothing yet. But would demand answers. Eliezer paused. Listened. Calculated. And then, for the first time in the entire story, he changed direction. Not toward home. Not toward the exit. But toward the storage wing. Where prisoners were held. Where chaos could be born. Where Weiss's fragile lie could unravel if the wrong person was questioned. Where the boy could set the stage for something larger than survival. Something like a disappearance, a jailbreak, a myth. Eliezer reached the corridor of holding rooms. He closed his eyes. Listened. 3 guards. One asleep. One bored. One alert but slow. Keys on the left hip. Holster strapped too tightly. Boots worn on the inside edges. The boy whispered, "This is where they end it, or where I begin." He stepped forward. Silent. Strategic. Skinned. Unseen. And the myth of the ghost child moved into its final chapter. The corridor leading to the detention rooms was narrow enough that the walls felt like they could collapse inward at any moment. The air was damp, metallic, tinged with the residue of cold breath and fear long settled into the concrete. Eliezer moved soundlessly. The lamp bulbs hummed overhead, half dead, illuminating the child's figure in stuttering intervals. Light, shadow, like the frames of a film reel stalling on a projector. His heartbeat was steady. His breathing calm. His mind sharper than any razor the Gestapo could conceivably wield. Behind him, the heavy steps of the SS Oberst echoed like a drum of approaching doom. He was closer now. Within minutes, he would reach Weiss's office and tear apart every lie Weiss clung to like a man drowning. Unless Eliezer intervened. Unless he redirected the storm. Unless he vanished in such a way that the Gestapo could never again accept a world where this child existed within its reach. The boy paused at the junction before the storage wing. He listened. Not with ears. With intuition honed by months of hiding in walls thinner than paper, by nights hearing the scrape of boots outside attic boards, by hours reading danger not through sight but through vibrations. 3 guards ahead. Keys clinking. One yawning. One tapping a boot. One whispering a complaint about the cold. They didn't know Eliezer existed. They would soon. And then they would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget him. Eliezer stepped forward, entering the faint glow of the corridor. A guard sniffed. Another scratched his beard. None noticed the boy. He walked right past them. Not because they were blind. Not because he was invisible. But because his steps were chosen with calculated precision, entering their peripheral vision when their eyes were tired, their attention drifting, their minds occupied with duty rather than danger. They saw him. And dismissed him instantly. The starving boy. Another prisoner's child. A shadow out of place but not important enough to matter. Until it was too late. Eliezer approached the first holding door. He studied the lock. It was German steel, manufactured in Dresden. A triple mechanism. Easily broken with force, but he didn't need force. He needed memory. He replayed the sound he heard earlier when a guard had opened a neighboring cell. 3 clicks. A scrape. A heavier click. The order mattered. He whispered the rhythm to himself, tapping the air like conducting a silent orchestra. Click, click, scrape, click. He reached for the keys dangling from the belt of the sleeping guard. He did not steal them. He simply nudged them. Just enough for the guard to shift in his sleep, and the keys slipped free from the loose hook, clattering into Eliezer's waiting hands with a sound softer than a breath. He caught them perfectly. Without even looking. He inserted the key into the first lock. Turned slowly. 1 click. Then another. A scrape. The final click. The door opened with a sigh. Inside were 5 prisoners, men with hollowed cheeks, bruised wrists, and lungs filled with the dust of despair. When they saw the silhouette of a child in the doorway, they froze. Not understanding. Not believing. Not trusting. "Don't speak," Eliezer whispered. His voice wasn't soft. It wasn't loud. It was something else entirely. Certain. The prisoners obeyed instantly. He pointed to the corner. "There's a blind spot behind the vent pipes. Move there. Now." They hesitated. Eliezer's expression didn't change. But his eyes flickered with something ancient, something that made desperate men obey without question. The men moved. Eliezer closed the door gently. One cell freed was not the goal. That would merely alert the guards. No. He needed the illusion of spontaneous escape. Something so baffling the Gestapo would blame it on internal sabotage. A spark of chaos that erased him from every possible narrative. He moved to the second cell. Click, click, scrape, click. 4 more prisoners. He pointed to the bed frame. Lift it. They stared. Now. They lifted. He slid the frame just enough so the floorboard beneath was exposed. A board weakened by mold, a structural flaw he'd noticed earlier when passing by in custody. He pointed to the opening. Hide there. They didn't question. He closed the door again. The third cell. The fourth. The fifth. By the time Eliezer reached the final room, his plan had woven itself into a tapestry of inevitability. Here, in the last cell, was something different. A teenage girl, perhaps 15, with short hair roughly chopped, wearing a torn coat 2 sizes too big. Her eyes were red but sharp in a way that suggested she had once known courage before the world attempted to steal it from her. She stepped forward when she saw him. She did not speak. She only mouthed, "Are you real?" Eliezer didn't answer. Instead, he knelt beside the bench lining the wall. He pressed the loose hinge, a detail he had recorded upon entering hours earlier. The hinge snapped. The underside of the bench popped open like a lid. "Hide," he whispered. The girl crawled in without hesitation. Her fear was real. Her belief was real. Her survival would be real. Eliezer closed the compartment. He stepped back. He turned out the corridor light. Then he walked away. Calm. Silent. Like a child returning home. The SS Oberst reached Weiss's office 3 minutes later. 3 minutes too late. He entered with explosive impatience. Weiss stood at attention, trembling despite his rigid posture. "Oberst Reinhardt," Weiss stammered. "I was about to." The Oberst raised his hand. "Weiss," he said quietly, "why is the interrogation room empty?" The officer choked. "Empty, sir?" Reinhardt's eyelid twitched. "The child. The boy from the ghetto. The one you detained. The one you accused." Weiss swallowed. He left, sir." The silence that followed was colder than the entire Polish winter. Reinhardt stepped closer, his shadow swallowing Weiss whole. "You released a Jewish child without my authorization?" Weiss's skin turned corpse white. "No, sir. The situation changed the evidence." Reinhardt hissed. "What evidence?" Eliezer, standing behind a corner, closed his eyes. He listened. He knew Weiss would not frame him. Not now. Weiss's voice cracked. "I believe Corbin misplaced the document, sir." Reinhardt stiffened. "Corbin?" "Yes, sir." Weiss's voice steadied slightly, because this was the truth he had chosen to believe. He was the last to access the drawer. The key marks match his grip. The drawer mechanism shows forced alignment consistent with his behavior. The timeline. Reinhardt cut him off with a snarl. "This is a serious accusation." Weiss nodded vigorously. "But the only logical one, sir. I will bring him for questioning immediately." Reinhardt stepped back. He folded his arms. Then he said the words that sealed Eliezer's plan perfectly. "Bring him. Now." Weiss rushed out. Reinhardt followed. The hallway filled with movement. Shouts. Boots clacking. Arguments erupting. Disbelief spreading like wildfire. And amid the chaos, the sleeping guard awoke only to scream. The cells? The prisoners, they're gone. Panic raced through the Gestapo headquarters like a plague. They vanished, into thin air. Nonsense. Prisoners cannot vanish. Check the floors, the vents, the ceilings, everything. Where is the boy? Where is the boy? Gestapo officers ran in every direction, slamming open doors, overturning benches, tearing at floor panels with crowbars. They found nothing. Of course they found nothing. Because Eliezer had not freed the prisoners. He had strategically hidden them. And because panic makes men blind, not observant. Doors were broken. Locks destroyed. Chains scattered. Evidence of a mass escape, manufactured by the meticulous hand of a child. A child who had just turned the headquarters into a maze of false clues. Weiss was screaming at Corbin. Corbin was screaming back. Reinhardt was demanding answers. The building roared with confusion. Eliezer walked through them all. Unnoticed, unremembered, because he was now exactly what the rumor would soon call him. A ghost. He reached the back exit, a door used only for removing trash, supplies, or bodies no one wanted to acknowledge. It was locked. Of course it was. But Eliezer wasn't concerned. He didn't need the key. He simply waited. 20 seconds. 21. 22. A janitor rounded the corner, dragging a bucket, cursing under his breath about incompetent soldiers making a mess. He unlocked the door, propped it open, stepped outside to throw out the water. Eliezer followed behind him with steps softer than breath. The janitor turned, saw a child, paused, brows furrowed. Where did you? Eliezer put one finger to his lips. The janitor stared. Then his eyes softened. He whispered, "Go." Eliezer walked into the alley. Snow kissed his cheeks. Cold wrapped around him. And behind him, the janitor closed the door as if sealing a tomb. Within minutes, the Gestapo realized the boy was missing. Within hours, they realized multiple prisoners were missing. Within a day, the entire headquarters whispered frantic variations of the same story. A child walked past us. No, he vanished. He spoke like an adult. He didn't speak at all. He unlocked doors with no keys. He hid prisoners in impossible places. I swear, he froze Weiss with a look. He is not normal. He is not human. He is der Geisterjunge, the ghost child. The myth was born instantly. Faster than fear. Faster than logic. Faster than truth. And while the Gestapo tore Warsaw apart searching for him, Eliezer watched from the rooftops. Hidden. Silent. Waiting for nightfall. That night, from the cracked roof of a burned-out bakery, Eliezer lit a tiny match. A single flame. Small. Insignificant. He let it burn until it touched his skin. He did not flinch. Then he dropped it. The flame landed upon a strip of cloth, a torn piece of an old coat, placed deliberately beside one of Reinhardt's patrol routes. When the soldiers found it, they panicked. It's his. He's nearby. Spread out. Find him. They searched for hours. They found nothing. Because by then, he was long gone. Eliezer disappeared into the forests beyond the city, becoming nothing more than a whisper on the cold wind. Some said he joined partisans. Some claimed he walked alone. Some swore he turned into a shadow that haunted the Gestapo for the rest of the war. And years later, long after Nazi boots stopped echoing through Europe, old soldiers would gather in dim taverns and murmur the same chilling phrase. If a door opened on its own, if a prisoner vanished from a locked cell, if a child walked past you without a sound, you knew he was near. And in the ruined archives of Warsaw, scribbled in handwriting no one could ever trace, someone left a single line. A ghost cannot be captured.